Welcome back to Petty Astrology. I'm your host, Kaycee Felton-Lui. I've heard that some of you have missed me, and while it's nice to hear, I never went away. If you remember from the last episode of Season 3, I said I'd still be very active in Patreon, and I have been. I've made several new episodes, including kicking off Season 4 with my 2-part episode on the astrology of 2025. I've met with the Petty Astrology Club twice, and we've been chatting about astrology and current events in our community spaces. One of the reasons I've switched things up with how I do Petty Astrology is I made 50 episodes of the podcast in 2024, and I still could not pay my bills. So not only have I been burnt out, I've been hustling to survive, as I'm sure many of my listeners relate to. But I had to reflect on the world that we're living in and how I was managing my energy. Making free stuff every week is just not sustainable, especially when you have a small platform. So I'm doing more in Patreon because it helps me to be compensated for the labor I do. Yes, it's a labor of love, but my landlord unfortunately doesn't accept likes and listens for rent. And I like the changes because it's given me more time to prepare for new things that I'm doing in 2025, and more on that in future episodes. We've also been building a beautiful, mutually supportive community around this podcast for over a year now. And I like to thank my sponsors for their support because it, in a very literal way, allows me to do what I do. I know that I've seen a lot of frustration online with things like paywalls, but you have to understand that we've been conditioned to devalue people's work. That's why the US federal minimum wage in the year 2025 is only $7.25. That's why people get mad at creatives for not doing endless unpaid work. Why most of us wear clothes and use items made by people working in sweatshops. And that's why a lot of people have no problem with using AI, which has quote-unquote intelligence built off of the stolen labor of other people. We are swimming in normalized exploitation. I talk a lot about building the future you want to live in, and it really does start with us. Does the future you want really come at the cost of continuing to take advantage or feigning ignorance? I had to be real with myself about my very real needs, and no one deserves to be exploited. Not you, and not me. And I don't think we get to enjoy a fairer future if we continue to devalue art and the real and meaningful labor that goes into producing it. So I hope you'll understand why I'm trying to create change in my corner of the world, why there's less on my public feed, and more in a space where I'm financially and energetically respected, and where I can speak more freely. Because there are fewer and fewer places where that doesn't come at a cost. Today on the podcast, the first episode in my new series about some of the big issues we're facing in Pluto and Aquarius, starting with censorship and strategies on how we can fight back and create a better world. Censorship is not new, but with Pluto and Aquarius, we are seeing it being more exposed as well as evolving. We've already seen the beginning of that rise, and we will continue to see more this year and next in particular. This Pluto and Aquarius energy really lends itself to people in power trying to control the masses by shaping the narrative, by shaping the way that we are able to share and broadcast information. That is why those that own most major media corporations are very wealthy people, because it's an investment that pays dividends, because they want your attention. And in a lot of cases, they want you to believe the perspectives they're presenting are fair and accurate. But a lot of these approved outlets have pretty limited objectives, as we've seen. So it's important to zoom out and see some of the themes of these narratives, because one of the things that fascism does is try to control the narrative and reduce diversity of thought and perspective in every way. Sound familiar? The kind of censorship I'm focusing on today is done by governments and large companies. Cops, the legal system, and companies themselves enforce it. And we know that companies finance and lobby government officials heavily here in the United States to do their bidding. So that line continues to be somewhere between blurry and non-existent. I'm going to use a lot of US examples because there's a lot of them, and that's what I'm most familiar with. But remember that these transits are global. Fascism is rising worldwide, and censorship comes along with it. It's part of upholding the whole apparatus. And Trump and his wealthy cronies will be mentioned a lot because it's currently happening and accelerating. But please remember that this stuff has been happening for years, even with Democrats in office, even with Democrats voting for policies that have made this a lot easier. Putting it all on one villain is missing the bigger picture, and that's not how we get past this. Some of the recent examples we've seen of censorship are the Trump administration continuing the efforts of Project 2025, which has been in the works for decades. If you haven't noticed, the American conservative wing of politics in this country has been on a mission for generations now, and it's been a very effective one because a lot of groundwork has been laid for leadership of all kinds to exploit these things. And obviously we're seeing a very bold instance of this type of exploitation. We just had censorship pretty blatantly happening with the removal of certain language, certain words from government websites, institutions, and research. Some of those words are ability, acceptance, affirmative, aggression, allyship, belonging, bias, black, culture, diversity, empathy, empowerment, gay, handicap, transgender, gender, just the word gender, LGBTQ, binary, intersex, asexual, queer, bisexual, inclusion, indigenous, intersectionality, justice, Native American, power dynamics, privilege, race, redistribution, representation, social justice, and also white. And from another list, activism, activists, advocacy, biased, Black and Latinx, community equity, cultural differences, cultural heritage. And those aren't even all of the terms, but this is a very clear attempt to erase conversations that have been happening about inequities in our society. And why would that be? Because, of course, the people that currently hold power are threatened by these conversations because it would disrupt the power imbalance if these things moved from being conversations to things that people are taking action on, as they have been. So this is a pretty clear instance of, if we don't talk about it, these things will disappear. And we know that's not true, but they're trying. Because in order to execute fascism, you have to uphold power imbalances. It's just a part of the system, much like the capitalist system that we live under. It requires that some people be below and others be above. But if we aren't allowed to articulate that in educational material, in research, you can see how it becomes a bigger issue. The Trump administration is also attempting to remove so-called diversity and inclusion hires. And this is, again, the same thing. They want to shape the narrative, and they want to reduce us taking action on things that attempt to resolve the social inequities like racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, that often shape hiring practices and who even gets to be in the room. Because if those voices aren't there, it results in a censorship of those perspectives within influential spaces. And this is not to say that somebody that represents a certain group represents everybody in that group. Of course not. But I think that diversity efforts have been made because we live in a deeply bigoted and unequal culture. So people with different perspectives are a threat to the status quo and to the fascism that they're trying to build out of something that has been present in our culture here in the United States for a long, long time, from the origins of this country. They want the dominance and control that they feel that they're entitled to. Another way we've seen censorship rising is by the redefining of terms. We've seen equating anti-Semitism with standing against Israel. We've also seen claiming that Antifa is an organized group rather than what it really is, which is autonomous anti-fascists taking action all around the world. And these are both very clearly politically motivated, right? Because we have seen over and over and over anti-Semitism coming from the very people that are being heralded as champions of Israel. And we know that they profit off of Israel's continued success in dominating the region by force. They're invested in arms dealers, contractors, all kinds of destruction and devastation. And by painting Antifa as a real group that they can attack, knowing that it is actually not that at all, it gives them cover to point the finger at really anybody that bothers them and accuse them of terrorism, essentially. And that means that the general public is being trained to be less sympathetic to people that are protesting, whether they're Antifa or not. It's an attempt to make sure that more don't join these people, that they don't support what they're doing, the resistance that they're engaging in. Because even if it's not your brand of resistance, the things that these people are fighting for, which is an end to an ongoing genocide and an end to fascism, are causes that benefit most human beings. It is not good for most people to live in a world where you can be genocided without consequence. It is not good for people in the world to be subject to fascism without consequences. But by redefining these terms and attempting to control the narrative, they're explicitly attempting to control resistance. The control of information in general has, of course, been a huge part of this wave of censorship that we've been seeing. And we have long had attacks on things like WikiLeaks and whistleblowers like Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning. But the Trump administration is reportedly looking at some pretty extreme ways of discouraging whistleblowers, like embedding spies in different government departments. So we have to be mindful of that. They've also been chumming the waters, as I've said before. That means making the landscape of finding information that much harder to navigate by spreading lies, confusion, rapid fire information, or just things that don't make sense. Fascists have also been attacking libraries and banning books, organizing in schools and communities to make sure that certain topics are off limits for certain people or certain places. We've seen many examples of historical revisionism. So some recent examples: a Biden administration appointee, archivist Colleen Shogan, was recently outed for sanitizing U.S. history by downplaying things like the civil rights movement, labor union activism, contraceptives, Japanese internment camps, and the U.S. government's treatment of Native Americans, literally rewriting history to downplay the parts that make people uncomfortable, but that still very much impact our world today. We've also seen attacks on critical race theory, queer history and experience, and Trump has threatened to defund schools that teach about the history of slavery. And we've seen people like Ron DeSantis in Florida changing curriculums. Not long ago, it was reported that the Texas Historical Commission has been removing books on racism and slavery from plantation gift shops. There's an active attempt to rewrite history. And again, this is not new. This is something that has been done by leaders for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But we have been seeing it come back in full force, and we are seeing it escalate. Another thing that we've been seeing is favoritism for certain news networks that are very in line with the conservative right-wing mission. And it's a form of censorship. It's called soft censorship, actually. The Trump administration has removed legacy outlets like NBC, the New York Times, NPR, and Politico from workspaces where they covered news from the Pentagon. And they're replacing those with One America News, which, by the way, makes Fox News look tame in comparison, Breitbart, the New York Post, and HuffPost. And this kind of soft censorship is because instead of telling people what they can and can't report, they're deciding who can even get access in the first place so that it doesn't seem as much like censorship. But we know what it is. We can see exactly what's going on. We have also seen lawsuits against different outlets and journalists that aren't doing what this administration wants. And unfortunately, Trump has been getting a lot of payouts from these news organizations that seem to really want to comply with Trump and his cronies this time around. So it's something that we need to remember whenever we're engaging with a lot of these outlets. And in fact, this is a tactic that we're going to continue to see being used, and is one of the reasons why a lot of these outlets are folding, because they don't want to get bankrupted by these continued lawsuits that they have to fight and probably settle, because it's very expensive to litigate issues like this. And you can see why this makes it even harder on independent journalists that don't even have the semblance of protection from an institution of some kind. Not only can lawsuits be used to destroy somebody's finances, but they can also be used to destroy reputations and make somebody unhireable. And I don't doubt that they're going to continue to do that. And in fact, we've also seen outlets enforcing censorship by firing their own journalists. We have seen in recent years journalists being fired for calling the genocide in Gaza a genocide in Gaza, for calling the Elon Musk Nazi salute a Nazi salute. Another form of censorship that we've been seeing are attacks on expression on social media. Meta and TikTok have both suppressed content about certain political issues, like the genocide in Palestine, and made it harder for that information to be shared as widely. I personally noticed on TikTok, when I started talking about politics, my account was essentially destroyed in terms of views. Everything was downhill. And I know that a lot of other people have had similar experiences and experienced suppression and so-called shadow banning Meta has removed accounts for allegedly promoting terrorism and things like that, just for sharing news, sharing what's really happening on the ground, because the narrative doesn't fit with their political agenda. Even Blue Sky, which is a platform that I like and I think is better than Twitter, has suspended accounts for Palestinians who are trying to fundraise to survive manufactured scarcity, soaring prices, and just like total obliteration. But these accounts are being labeled as spam, even though these are just people in a very desperate situation, trying to survive. And we've also seen the reverse of censorship, allowing hate speech and transphobic slurs, as Meta recently let us know that they're cool with. Meta and TikTok moderation have given people violations or suspended their accounts for posting about issues that don't fall in line with their preferred narrative. You can receive violations from these platforms for saying pretty minor, pretty harmless things. At the same time, they will let people espouse racist and hateful views or just blatant misinformation, no problem. That is a form of censorship. That is a form of shaping the narrative. And it's also part of why we're at the point that we're at, which has been well documented in the case of Meta and Facebook. Another form of censorship that we've seen are attacks on resistance to fascism. Recently, Zionist organizations said that they were, quote unquote, assisting ICE in documenting attendees at a vigil for Hind Rajab. And if you don't know, Hind Rajab was a little girl who was murdered by the state of Israel in cold blood. And so these organizations said that they were going to document the attendees for a vigil for this little girl and send them to Trump. And meanwhile, we have the Trump administration indicating that they're going after student protesters. So it's really a match made in hell. We've also seen organizations and groups issuing death threats to people like Norman Finkelstein, who is a Jewish political scientist and Holocaust researcher who speaks out about the Palestinian genocide. International students are being labeled as Hamas supporters for protesting the genocide. And not only that, they're being deported for protesting. As Pluto moves through Aquarius, where it'll be until 2044, we will see continued attempts at gaining power over people through censorship. And it has evolved, and it will continue to evolve as technology evolves. But the good news is that we're seeing some threats to censorship already, and we will continue to. And my hope is that more and more people educate themselves about this and become involved in actively resisting this type of suppression. At the beginning of Pluto and Aquarius, I feel that the popularity of TikTok has shown a contrast to a lot of people for the first time in the difference between what mass media reports and what more independent narrators are depicting. And I think this shook a lot of people's reality up and made them look more critically at the information they're being shown and who's in control of it. So I think now more than ever, the people that control the narrative want to shore that up as much as possible. Because the internet has loosened the reins. It's given the average person more ability to share their perspective, share information than ever before. And the people in power don't want to loosen those reins. So part of controlling the narrative is controlling the internet. It's shaping the narrative. And in this case, a lot of that shaping is in the hands of fascists or people that are cool with fascism because it doesn't impact them too much. So they don't care. They might even make money off of it. And he is not the only one who's done such a thing. But I think one of the gifts of Elon Musk is that he has been so despicable out in public. He bought Twitter and no doubt has shaped that massive platform and continued to exercise his influence over particularly young men, and no doubt maneuvers that algorithm for his own purposes. I would be surprised if that did not have an impact on the US elections, and I think that was on purpose. And I think people have underestimated the power of that control, as they've underestimated billionaires controlling legacy media for decades. It's important to remember that just because the people currently in power are trying these things, are doing these things, does not mean that they will ultimately win. The power of Pluto and Aquarius is in collective action when we get organized enough to put stops to this machine. So here are some strategies for combating censorship. Firstly, it is so important to ask questions. Our narratives are being shaped, always, by somebody, and that doesn't always have to be a sinister thing, but we need to be more aware of that and more skeptical of our narrators. Where do they get their funding? Who sets the tone? Who or what is deciding what is factual about what you're consuming? We've never been able to afford being passive consumers of information, but especially not now. Another way to combat censorship is by not self-censoring. We want to be careful with how we engage with censorship, but to the best of your ability, don't just censor yourself. Don't just fall in line. Self-censorship is a legitimate form of censorship, where those in power get us to follow their rules without having to do too much to enforce it. They win. So be strategic in how you communicate and what you comply with or what you choose to subvert, because those are acts of resistance. Surveillance is a very real thing that we need to be factoring in here, and it doesn't require censorship, but it is harder to enforce censorship without some form of surveillance. So a big part of this is resisting surveillance culture too. It can be a delicate line to walk, especially when legal issues or your job are on the line. But we need to not accept censorship by finding creative ways to subvert these things and share information and ideas. One example that I can think of is people who make videos on TikTok and talk about certain topics know that they've had to use kind of weird code language to get around censorship and the suppression of videos. So things like that, where you're not stopping giving the information, but you're not blatantly breaking the rules and making it easy for you to get shut down. We also need to continue to bring censorship to light. Do not shut up about it. Talk to people about it in your life, at the grocery store, at the mechanic, whoever. Also spread physical information anonymously. If you go to protests or direct action, wear a mask. Be hard to identify, because not only are there cops out there, but there are civilian fascist gang members who are documenting and outing people. If you have strong tech skills and you know how to make yourself difficult or impossible to trace, make sure that you use those skills and perhaps educate other people on how they could use those skills as well. If you or someone you know is in a position to leak information or be a whistleblower or just bring important truths to light, I would encourage you to do so, but do it wisely, because of course this is an environment where they're going to try to make examples of the people that don't fall in line. And this is why it's so important for the rest of us to support those people and don't leave them behind, because they're taking enormous risks for our collective benefit, and we need to have their back, like they're having our back. And that's what solidarity is really about. On that note, don't post death threats or illegal acts or your organizing plans on social media. Maybe don't even text about them. Learn how to use encrypted apps like Signal and learn to use them properly, and organize offline as much as possible. Because remember, our phones are tracking devices. They're microphones. They're things that can put us at risk when we're taking risks. You do not need an easy paper trail, which leads me to my next suggestion. Make it hard for them to enforce this shit. We have power in numbers. Collective disobedience, not allowing them to dictate what our culture is allowed to look like, is gonna be important. If nobody listens and nobody complies, it's gonna be very difficult to get us all. Actively involve yourself in resistance. This is something I've been talking about for years, but it's more important than ever. Support independent journalists, archivists, and creatives that are actively resisting, and support them with your attention, but if you can, also your money. Join library boards, school boards, educate people, do mutual aid projects that involve archiving and physical media. Because remember, not everything has to be online, and maybe some of it shouldn't be. And support the creation and use of strategic, worker-owned, and decentralized platforms as ways of sharing information. We need to not put our eggs in one platform basket. We need to not all congregate in one place, because that makes it harder to control us. And on that note, we need to adapt. I have long said that the people who don't remain flexible and open to changing their behavior will have the hardest time during Pluto and Aquarius. So we have to be light on our feet and adjust to rapidly changing circumstances. One of the things I've seen recently that has given me hope is people's willingness to leave legacy social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and even TikTok when there were signs of strong censorship and dubious influences. Keep that same energy, because even platforms that are doing well at the moment may change their ownership or their behavior, and we need to be responsive to that. I've also seen journalists who are being censored taking their work to their own independent platforms or smaller outlets so they can share information without being manipulated or silenced. I belong to a number of the categories on that Trump censorship list, and I know many of my listeners do too. We aren't going away. This is a reminder that our cultures have value, and if they didn't, those in power wouldn't be trying to erase it. We have power, or else they wouldn't want us to just shut up and disappear. So remember, people and places and organizations that are hostile to us, or just straight up fold when we're being dehumanized and persecuted, don't deserve our money, energy, and time. All of those things feed their power at a moment where it must be starved. And finally, cultivate the energy that you want more of. Remember what I said in the Astrology of 2025 episodes about watching our boundaries this year. There is a lot to focus on that is negative and scary. But when we pour all of our energy and attention into uplifting those ideas, we give them life. We create resistance in our bodies and in our energy, and that moves us in the opposite direction. Now, this is not to say we ignore the issues that we're facing, but we need our reaction to be to pour the energy that we do have into a new and better way of doing things. We need honesty. We need truth. We need artists and storytellers who aren't afraid to reflect their experience of our shared reality. And that's what my work is all about at the end of the day. Supporting us through this process of change so that we can show up fully and authentically for this fight. because it's about liberation for all of us, and we can't do it alone. Keep speaking, keep fighting, and most importantly, keep creating. If you haven't already, I would love if you checked out the Astrology of 2025. It's a 2-part episode I made for my Patreon sponsors. That's a 2-hour overview of the vibes, predictions, and strategies for navigating the historic year ahead. And it's a big year, so I tried to put as much information as I could. And I would love it if you joined us on Patreon. There's free stuff too, articles, my newsletter, and our chat community. Plus, there's tons of previous podcast episodes that are public and still have great information in them for the times that we're living in. And for just $5 a month, you can get more bonus episodes, other astrological and spiritual stuff I create, and more behind-the-scenes updates just for my sponsors. And if you are a sponsor, we've started a little radical book club in our Discord community. I'm thinking that we'll meet quarterly, and our first is on March 2nd. We're reading Love in a Fucked Up World, How to Build Relationships, Hook Up, and Raise Hell Together by the wonderful Dean Spade. I am really looking forward to it, and we're going to be learning more about how to relate to one another, how to organize together, and build this better future that I'm always talking about. So I hope to see you there, and in the meantime, please take care of yourself and each other. That's it for this episode. Tune in on Patreon for even more petty astrology. This episode was written, edited, and produced by me, Kaycee Felton-Lui. The podcast art is by Max Swanson. The intro and outro music is by Paul Schneider, and the jazz piece is by Denis Pavlov. This episode was made possible by my sponsors over on Patreon.